Hello and welcome to the Montana Budget and Policy Center's fourth session of our State Tribal Policy Symposium. This session is titled Testimony, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. My name is Dahlia Kilsback. I'm the State Tribal Policy Outreach Coordinator, and this is my colleague Preston Parrish, who's the State Tribal Policy Analyst. So the Montana Budget and Policy Center is a nonprofit C3 research organization that focuses on budget, tax, and economic issues impacting low and moderate income Montana families. Mine and Preston's work as the state tribal team focuses on how the budget, tax, and economic issues in the state impact Indian country. This week's symposium is designed to introduce people on how to engage in state budget and legislative processes. Across this week, we will focus on different ways to do just that. So again, this session is titled Testimony, Advocacy, and Community Engagement. During this session, attendees will learn from highly experienced organizers and advocates how to lobby at the state capitol, including methods of building relationships with legislators and how to provide legislative testimony. This session will also look beyond the legislative session to long-term engagement with your community, as well as how powerful it can be to work with advocacy organizations to achieve these goals. As our panelists, we have Iku Beck, who is a community organizer at Montana Women Vote, and Jordan Thompson, who is an attorney and state lobbyist for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. For this session, we will have a quick poll, and then Preston will be doing a quick presentation on testimony and how you can get involved during the legislative session. And after that, we will have some time for our panelists to answer questions that will be moderated by myself. And for the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will have audience doing Q&A. So before we begin, just some quick housekeeping for the audience. So all audience members are on mute and your camera is off. The session is being recorded and will be sent out to registrants at the end of the week along with other resources. Q&A will be at the end of the session, but you can submit your questions to the host at any time in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom, and your chat is also off. So before I hand this over to Preston, we're going to do a quick poll. And our first question is, what happens when American Indians engage in the budgeting process? First, they improve the state's recognition of tribal policy interests. They can bring attention to important issues in their community. They may influence their legislators to advocate for a state budget that reflects the community's needs, or all of the above. Second, why do federal dollars sometimes go unclaimed by tribal nations in Montana, and where does this money go? Tribal nations are sometimes not even aware the funding is available, and the federal dollars are either sent back to the federal reserves or they are redirected to other programs in the state. Or second, tribal nations choose not to claim these funds and the federal dollars are sent to the state instead. Our last question is, what do you want to know more about? Giving testimony, lobbying, advocacy organizations, getting my community involved, or all of the above? And so we're just going to take a couple more seconds for all of the attendees to answer these questions. All right, and results, please. First question, everyone got that correct. Congratulations, it is all of the above. Second question, everyone also got that all correct. It is the first answer. And your third question, thank you for participating in that. It's great to see what y'all are interested in. And now I will hand this over to Preston for his presentation.
Thanks, Dahlia. Thanks, Iku and Jordan, for joining us, and thanks everyone for hopping on for today's session. I am quickly going to go over how to find who represents you, what to keep in mind for effective advocacy, and some tactics to influence legislation. Like on Monday, just note that everything that we cover in this presentation today and more is included in our state budget handbook, which you can find at montanabudget.org. ledge.org. I'll also drop it in the chat box. So if you want to follow along online, that's there. So next slide, please. So this map is a bit hard to read, but what it's showing is that every Montanan has one state House rep and one senator, and their job is to represent you and advocate your needs. Next slide. So we walked through this a bit on Tuesday, but just as a refresher, to find who represents you, go to ledge.mt.gov and look up your legislator by your address. You can meet with legislators to voice your needs and concerns. Note that establishing a personal relationship with your legislators makes for more effective advocacy. So a good way to begin building a relationship with your legislators once you identify who it is that represents you is to meet with them, to make an introduction, or to talk about the legislative session. Early conversations may include questions to help establish the legislator's motivations, their legislative agenda, their contact preference, and just their general concern of Indian country. Montana's part-time legislators do not have in-district offices. It's important to note that, but their contact information should be available on the legislature's website. Again, that's ledge.mt.gov. So next slide, please. So here are some steps to consider for advocacy. There's a lot here, but first, it's important to know who represents you. We just covered that. And then think about the problem that you want to bring to their attention. So for example, you want more support for Indian-owned small businesses. Next, identify the policy decision and legislation. So for example, here it could be funding for the Indian Country Economic Development Program. Identify what you want to accomplish or change. Is that to maintain proposed funding for the program or to expand the budget? Find where the legislation is in the process via laws on the legislative website. And again, in case folks missed that presentation on Tuesday, or if you just want to reference it again, we walked through the laws website. Understand which legislators are key decision makers or leaders on the policy. And that means looking beyond those who represent your district to find legislators who may have expressed interest in the issue or who serve on a committee relevant to the issue. You can find a comprehensive list of every committee and its members also at ledge.mt.gov. Understand the issue through personal research and conversations with a trusted organization or other source of information. Find out about the work of other groups in your community or state that are working on the issue and tap into their efforts. So for example, tribal governments may employ a lobbyist like Jordan and then take a particular issue, take a position on a particular issue. Advocacy organizations such as Montana Women Vote or Western Native Voice may be working on an issue. So look to those organizations or groups and tap into their efforts. And then finally, determine a course of action to pursue. We'll talk a little bit about some of these different courses of action, but you can write a letter or email, you can call legislators, you can meet with legislators, or you can testify at public hearings. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go over just a couple of these different avenues especially for those avenues that might seem the most intimidating. Meeting with legislators with a specific request. So if you've determined that your course of action is meeting with the legislator, here are just some things to keep in mind. Ideally, you'll already have established a relationship by the point you're meeting for a specific request. So first, make an appointment in advance when possible. Write, email, or call to request a meeting. Again, you can find contact information for your legislator at ledge.mt.gov. Connect with advocacy organizations ahead of your meeting if possible. In some cases, professional staff are working on state policy and they may be able to provide information and materials related to the issue. Prepare an agenda for your meeting. Limit your agenda to 2 or 3 items, just understanding that the meeting may be brief, 15 minutes or less. Bring information that may be useful for your legislator. That can include relevant articles from the local newspaper, statistics about your community or the issue that is of interest to you, and fact sheets about legislation you're asking the legislator to support or oppose. And provide personal examples whenever possible. I'm sure Jordan and Iku will also mention that. And then follow up with a thank you and provide any information that you promised or that provides additional support for your position. So next slide, please. So some other ways to get your voice heard are included on this slide. We just touched on a bit of this, but one of those is to write a letter or send an email. Keep it short and sweet. Make it personal. Your own experience is the best evidence to relay. Describe what you want the legislator to do. For example, ask them to support, co-sponsor, or oppose a particular bill, or to increase funding for a program. And include your name, address, and a little about yourself. The second, testify at a hearing. We'll actually go over this in more detail on the next slide. The third, organize a call-in to legislators. A lot of calls to a legislator during the same period of time helps bring their attention to a particular issue. It also puts some pressure on them to act in a particular way. Write a letter to the editor of a local newspaper. Legislators stay on top of community public opinion through their local newspapers. So submit a brief, here we're talking 250 words or less, letter to the editor to express your support or opposition to a particular bill. And then the final one, become active on social media. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever your legislator is active. And again, our state budget handbook covers all of these and in more detail. So next slide, please. So I wanted to spend a little more time on testifying. It's important to note that anyone may testify during a public hearing and legislative committee. Committee hearings allow you the opportunity to address concerns about proposed legislation before the committee takes action and before the bill makes its way to the House and Senate for debate and final vote. You can testify in person or submit written testimony. I know that we've touched on this over the course of the week, but there may be opportunities this coming session to get involved virtually. Find out when the hearing is scheduled. Again, do this through the law's website. You can reference the video we put together on Tuesday if you want a walkthrough of that. You can also find that information in our budget handbook. Here, it's also important to note that hearing dates can pop up quickly and meeting rooms can change at the last minute. So make sure to check frequently for details. Arrive early to the hearing, but note that you can enter or leave at any time, even if the door is closed and the hearing is already in progress. Prepare before attending the hearing. Read the most recent version of the bill before testifying. Take note of key talking points. Be concise and speak clearly. State your most important arguments first in case you run out of time. Be prepared by having a 2-minute version of your testimony, again, in case time is limited. It's also a good idea to have a written statement, again, in case time is tight. It's always best to assume that you will have limited time. This is just a note. Expect to see most people dressed in business or business casual clothing. Sign in. Every hearing includes an entryway table with a sign-in sheet. Speakers identify themselves as proponents, those for the bill, opponents, those against, or informational witnesses. Informational witnesses are generally used by government personnel. Use proper legislative hearing protocol. Effective public testimony is short, generally less than 2 minutes. At the beginning of the testimony, open with, "Chair, my name is state your name, spell your name. I represent myself or an organization, and I am speaking to support or oppose Senate or House bill number. So for example, if I were testifying, my script might sound like, Chair, my name is Preston Parrish, first name spelled Preston, last name spelled Parish, with the Montana Budget and Policy Center. I'm speaking to support House Bill 632. And remember that there is a set order for testimony, so those in support go first, after which the chair of the committee allows opponents to speak. Submit a copy of written testimony. Again, it's just important to have this in case time is limited. Be prepared to answer questions from legislators. Although you can't direct questions to them during hearings, legislators may call on you to answer questions. When answering questions, first address the chair of the committee, then address the legislator asking the question. So for example, a response might sound like, Chair, Representative Barr, thank you for the question. I am in support of X because of Y. Next slide, please. And here, I just wanted to note that all testimony becomes part of the public record. So just something to keep in mind when you're testifying. So that's it. It's a pretty quick presentation that we have today. Again, you can find this and more in our budget handbook, which I dropped in the chat box there, but you can also find that on our website at montanabudget.org. And I will turn it back over to Dahlia.
All right, thank you, Preston. So panelists, Iku and Jordan, thank you so much for your time here today. I just wanted to start with, could you tell us a little bit more about your work and what you've been up to recently? And I think we could begin with Jordan.
Dahlia and Preston in Montana Budget and Policy Center. So my name is Jordan Thompson. I'm an attorney and tribal member here for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. I might refer to it as CSKT, standing for Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. And then I'm also the state lobbyist. So every legislative session, I get shipped off to Helena and get to do that. So it's the political world's a completely different world, and I really enjoy it. But for the most part, I'm a lawyer in my day job. And right now, one of the really interesting things I get to work on is CSKT's food security project. And so that's keeping me pretty busy. And of course, gearing up for the legislative session. So good to be here today.
Thank you, Jordan. And Iku?
Okay, thanks for having me, y'all. So I work for Montana Women Vote as a community organizer. We have two other people that work in community engagement and organizing. And we're an advocacy organization that works mostly on economic justice issues. And so this season, things are looking very different, obviously, because of the pandemic. We're not doing in-person organizing. So we've switched to a lot of digital organizing. We're doing a lot of texting and calling outreach around the census and getting people to register to vote right now. And additionally, I'm working with people to prepare them to use their experiences and stories to change policy, either through any of the various methods that Preston just mentioned, LTEs, testimony, all that jazz. So if anyone's interested in being a part of that, we have a story collection section on the Montana Women Vote website. And that's what I've been up to thus far. Yeah, it's been an interesting new experience in the digital world, so.
Thank you, Iku. Jordan, could you tell us why community engagement at the state level is important for Indian country?
Sure. So from my perspective, being a lawyer, you sure learn a lot in law school about the federal and tribal relationship. But what I didn't learn was the incredible amount of tribal state relationships that are happening, especially in Montana. And so I thought the Montana Budget and Policy Center did a really nice job of breaking down a lot of those interactions in your guys' handbook. So we're talking about healthcare, economic development, education, language programs, jurisdictional issues, the list goes on. And so it's just so important that we tribal folks are there to provide our perspective on these relationships, to try to ensure that the relationships are good ones. One thing I've really noticed is how different being a Native person at the legislature, how different my worldview is. Coming from a tribal perspective and representing a tribes, like the tribal perspective is so much different from, I'd say, the mainstream view. And so it's really important, especially when we're trying to pass or stop legislation that affects our tribal communities, to bring that worldview there. And so especially when you have like a whole group of folks with that same worldview in a room, it's a really powerful experience. And so I just really think that to honor our relationships and have good relationships, it's important to engage in the process.
Thank you, Jordan, for that perspective. And Iku, same question. Why is community engagement at the state level important for Indian country?
I would echo similar sentiments in that there are a lot of decisions made at the state level that impact Native people, be they on reservations or off reservations. And it's important that we're engaged in what's happening to us and to our communities, and that our perspectives are brought to different legislators' tables, because a lot of people otherwise wouldn't know what Native experiences are unless you bring it to them and tell them what they are. Yeah, so I think that's some of the reasons why it's important, but there's just so many state policies that are really important: healthcare, education, all that jazz. And yeah.
Thank you, Iku. So our next question is, we know engaging with legislators happens in many different forms and can look different depending on where we're at in the relation to the session. So how do you build those relationships, and how does it help you to advance a policy priority? Jordan?
So yeah, kind of to the first part of the question, where it might look different depending on where we're at in the session. That's true. Like at the beginning of the session, everyone's a lot happier than they are at the end of the session, when people are getting really kind of cranky, kind of time strapped. And so it's really important, I'd say, to have those relationships throughout the whole thing, but especially at the end. And so I think it's really important for everyone to find their style. And so my style is, I'm pretty calm and I try to be calm and collected no matter what the issue is. Just be informed, very respectful, and really try to be as informed as I can be too. And so throughout the session, when legislators hear me talk, they go, oh, here's a guy who's actually done his research and is providing some honest answers to us. And so at the end of the session, when I might only have 10 seconds and say, hey, we really need this, or we can't have that because of this, it's like they don't have to vet my answer. They know I'm telling the truth because I've done so the whole session. So I'd start there. Just really, I'd say having legislators that know who you are, know they can trust you, is going to be really important and beneficial throughout the whole session.
Thank you, Jordan. And Iku, so that question is, how do you build those relationships, and how does it help you to advance policy priorities?
Yeah, so for my organization, it definitely isn't my primary job to be building relationships with specific legislators. I think that one of the easiest ways for me to get to know some of the Native legislators, which is probably not going to be an option this year, was just going to the second floor and to the Indian Affairs office. And there's always people hanging out there. And it was suggested to me by someone who previously had worked in the Capitol to just go hang out there. And that's a way to make relationships, which I think is true. And also, as an advocacy organization, we create opportunities for other people to develop relationships, often through things like lobby days. There's a bunch of other advocacy organizations, including MBPC, who host or co-host lobby days, where it's just an opportunity where people have already kind of pre-picked which legislators need to be spoken to. And then they just send out people from different communities to go speak to those legislators and talk about their experiences and why they support specific legislation. And I think that that's a great opportunity for people to build relationships with their legislator, and also just it's less high pressure than doing or testifying in front of a bunch of people, because you're just having a conversation with someone. And yeah, I'd say those are the primary ways that I through my work currently engage with legislators. There are other people at my organization who definitely have more one-on-one relationships in order to build policy related things, but I'm kind of a newbie. I've only been to one legislative session thus far.
Thanks, Iku, for telling us more about the advocacy side of things. So our next question is related to the previous question. Different groups and people bring their own interests and perspectives to the table. How do you build coalitions that are sustainable and cohesive? So Jordan?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about coalitions, or at least when I'm thinking about coalitions, I'm thinking about groups that are trying to advance an issue or an interest, right? And so like, well, is there like just a catch-all for tribes or tribal interests? Well, luckily at the legislature, there's a really good group called the Indian Caucus. And so that's a group that meets weekly, and it's just Indian legislators or legislators from reservation communities or just legislators that care about tribes and tribal folks. So they meet once a week. And so to be involved in that committee is really beneficial because it's kind of a built-in coalition into the legislature, and they're a really powerful voting bloc. And so if you can get in with them and just really help them to understand your issue, then that's a really good start. As a tribal lobbyist, there's just a lot of different things we're looking at, from environmental issues, education issues, healthcare issues, the list goes on. And so it's really issue-based a lot of the time, beyond like kind of the tribal things where most tribes agree on 99% of the issues. A lot of the other issues might be just environmental groups, or those wildlife groups are always our friends. It just depends really on the issue, but it's not hard to find who the other folks are that care about issues, and then just having those conversations and just brainstorming on ways to advance that issue or priority has been really effective for me. So yeah, team building's great at the legislature.
Thanks, Jordan. And so Iku, that question was, how do you build coalitions that are sustainable and cohesive?
Yeah, so for organizing in Montana, it's super essential that you work with coalitions, just because it's such a large state and people can't travel that far or know people extremely well in every community in Montana. And I think that, similar to what Jordan said, issue-based or identity-based coalitions are pretty easy to both put together and maintain, just because if there's an issue or a campaign that it's all around, then there's a goal, and there are people who are from all different kinds of backgrounds and all different kinds of opinions who can come together for that specific issue. If it's identity-based, for example, if it's for Indigenous people, then there's again like a common interest and an issue and a goal that's being sought after. And so I think, yeah, just so long as they're issue or identity-based coalitions, they have pretty good longevity and sustainability. And I think they only need to be brought together when they need to be brought together.
Thank you, Iku. So effective storytelling matters. How do you create a compelling narrative when testifying or advocating an issue to advance your priorities? Jordan?
So Native people are generally really good storytellers. We've been doing it for a long time, and we've been here for a long time. And so we have a really compelling story. Like when you look at the Salish Kootenai tribes, we've been here since time began. And that's how the other tribes in Montana are too. And so we're just natural storytellers. And so I think to have that baseline, if you have that baseline of who we are, then we can continue to tell that story in different forums, right? And so if there's a environmental bill and we're in the Natural Resources Committee, for instance, it's like, I'm still a tribal person and connected to the land, have relationship with the land, have relationship with the people, with the animals, with the waters, and with future generations. And so whatever I'm testifying on, I always have that baseline, and it makes for a really consistent story, right? And so legislators don't have to guess, I wonder what Jordan's going to be talking about today. They know, they're just hearing a different angle of it, right? And so I think once you have that baseline, the rest of the story can just kind of fill itself in, depending on what you're talking about. Now, a lot of issues, and so a lot of the issues require different thoughts, right? And so I'm a lawyer and I have an MBA. And so like a lot of times I'll have to bring in some of those perspectives too, or a community perspective. And so I'm talking to folks at our health department or at our tribal defender's office or something to understand on the ground. But a lot of times what I found is like when you do have such a long history, right? When we have, we're not a fifth or sixth generation Montanan, we're like been here since forever, thousands of years before Montana was even a state. Sometimes that can lead to just maybe people feeling a little uncomfortable. And so like, how do you tell a story where you're not alienating people, but kind of coalition building with legislators, right? Like, hey, we're all on the same team. We're all Montanans. And this piece of legislation benefits everybody. And so I really, really try to build into my story for a piece of legislation, how it benefits everybody. One thing I wanted to talk about just briefly was I see sometimes folks get up there and they yell around, and that's just not a compelling story. I've never seen anyone change their vote based on getting yelled at. You really have to change minds if you want to change a vote. And so how do you tell a compelling story in order to accomplish that? And that's what I always think about before I testify.
Thank you for that, Jordan. And Iku, just to reiterate, how do you create a compelling narrative when testifying or advocating an issue to advance your priorities?
I think it depends on the specific issue and bill that you're speaking to, what specific kind of narrative you would want to draw. But I think that overall authenticity is the most important thing, and people feeling comfortable in sharing their experience and feeling passionate about the fact that their experience relates to whatever policy they're speaking to. And I think that when you have that personal connection and a person who's ready and prepared and very passionate about the topic that they're speaking about, that you're able to make the narrative more compelling. But I mean, yeah, when it's 3 minutes, you kind of go by a little truncated version of an elevator speech often, if you can convince people to do that. And stay under the 3 minutes. But yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how people can trim down their story into a narrative that feels comfortable for them without like leaving out important things, because you're going to have to leave out a lot of important things when you're testifying. You just have to have your one little point that you're trying to get across. Because they're not going to remember very much from all the different testimonies that people bring.
If I could add on to that. Yeah, sometimes natives are too good of storytellers, right? And so then like you have an allocated amount of time for each bill. And so you might have 20 minutes per side for the proponents and opponents. And so if you have one guy talking for 19 minutes, that only leaves a minute for maybe 15 other people. And so one thing I've learned that I've really held on to, I learned it in law school, is just to have 3 points, have 3 main points you're trying to make. And I think if you just can really limit, like just hone in on those 3 points, that it creates more focused testimony and it creates points that people can remember. So I'd say try to limit your testimony to 3 main points. And that creates a compelling story.
Thank you both for those tips. Our next question is, the pandemic is creating a lot of uncertainty surrounding the 2021 legislative session. How do you plan to engage or prepare given this uncertainty? Jordan?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, but like my grandpa used to say, be alert. So I'm just being alert. I'm trying to figure out what the session's going to look like and just go from there. So I'm still planning on moving over there, but we'll see what the session looks like. The other thing that I've done to prepare is, like Preston mentioned in his beginning intro, is I went instead of back to school shopping, went to back to session shopping. It's just, whether you agree with it or not, you just have to understand the culture of the legislature. And the culture of the legislature, they just really expect you to look a certain way. And if you don't, you might not be taken as seriously as you might otherwise be. And so if you look like a legislator, you're probably in pretty good shape. You know, they're going to say, oh, this guy's got a collared shirt on. He's a professional. Or I've seen a lot of natives with their ribbon shirts or wing dresses on, and that's really cool too. And so just know that when you go to these things, it's really, it's helpful to look nice. And so I've done my back to session shopping. That's one thing I've done to prepare. And then just waiting to see what we're looking at for the session.
Thanks, Jordan. And Iku?
I think that we're doing similar preparations from what we have in past years, except for all digitally. So everything that we're doing is online right now. And we're also just waiting to see what it's going to be like to have people testifying online and stuff like that. On the local level, I have been able to engage with some city council meetings and see what they look like online and what testifying looks like and engaging the public looks like online. And I think that there are going to be a lot of challenges. I mean, the first being that not everyone can access the internet, but I also don't personally know exactly what the legislative session is going to look like. So currently we're just doing kind of similar things of trying to find people who are interested in sharing their experiences and preparing them for potential opportunities to share those experiences, but most likely not in person, because I think it's really important that we pay attention to people's health and be really cognizant of the inequities in access to healthcare, quality of healthcare, and pre-existing conditions that are occurring in Montana, especially in Indigenous communities, and try to prevent people from being exposed if they don't need to be. So I think mostly we're looking at figuring out how to get people engaged online.
Thank you, Iku, for bringing up those points. So our last question is, what can the audience do to engage in this upcoming session? And I know that we had just discussed the coronavirus and how that may impact, but just in your imagination, what can the audience do if it was a normal session or however you predict the session to go? Jordan?
I thought Preston had a really good list there in his presentation at the beginning of how to engage with the session. An add-on I'd like to mention, and it kind of relates to one of the previous questions, is one thing I did a few sessions ago was for some of the local candidates, they do different activities, like they go around and knock doors. They might not be doing that this time, but I drove some of those candidates around, and so I got to know them that way. And so when I saw them at the legislation, like, oh, there's Thompson, he drove me around. And so it's really good. Like, it's so, I mean, there's so many, there's 100 representatives and 50 senators, and then there's all kinds of government staff there. And so it is so difficult to get to know everybody. And so just start with someplace, right? Start with your representative, your senator, and go from there. Start with the Indian caucus and go from there. And for your coalitions, there's like Western Native Vote, there's like EQ's organization, there's all these wild, and so whatever your issue is, start getting to know them too. And so I'd say just really start getting to know the different players who are involved in this. And then the better relationship you have going into the session, the more they're going to know you and be able to connect you to how to be effective during the session. If you just pop up in the middle of the session, it's overwhelming, it's confusing. And so just try to get engaged early on by getting to know folks in the process would be my advice. And then once you get there in the process, you can lean on them to understand how to be effective during the process, whether that's coordinating a letter writing campaign, social media, calling your representatives. So yeah, just it's so relationship based, and as Native people, I think that comes naturally to us. And so just really developing those relationships is really important.
Thank you, Jordan. And Iku, so what can the audience do to engage in this upcoming session?
I would echo the need to engage with and follow organizations that are working to make sure that people are engaged with the legislature itself. Just because most people, I don't think that anyone has like people that work for them as a legislator. So there has to be these nonprofit organizations or these organizations that are engaging people, because there's no other conduit with the public essentially. And so there are a bunch of different advocacy organizations that are specifically trying to get people engaged. And so to follow them or get on their email lists or contact them if they're within the range of what your specific interests are. And that includes, yeah, Montana Budget Policy Center, Montana Women Vote, Western Native Voice / Montana Native Vote, Forward Montana, Planned Parenthood. A bunch of different advocacy organizations are going to be gearing up for the legislative session and doing work, and they'll all have opportunities for how people can engage. And also follow Montana Women Vote, which I already mentioned, but and we'll get you connected to ways to engage and with other organizations that are involved right now.
All right, thank you both for answering those questions. And now we are going to be opening it to Q&A from the audience. So if you haven't already done so and you have a question you want to ask Iku and Jordan, please put it into the Q&A function and we will get that answered. So our first question is that back in the day, a council person testified in Kootenai and got the point across. And right now we use English to respect our audience, but that's not always our authentic voice. Do you have any thoughts on that, either of you?
Well, yeah, it's once you understand the history of our tribal nations and signing treaties with the United States, and then Montana becoming a state way after that, right, in 1889, and how do you be an ambassador from a tribal nation to a state process? So I always start by saying, Chestsquext or Chestinya, like whatever time of the day it is appropriate. I always start off by saying my greeting in Salish. I should probably expand that to Kootenai this session. That's a good point. And so I just say that to honor where I'm coming from, but to speak to a legislative body from the whole state of Montana and understanding it's the Montana state body, it just would probably not be as effective to testify in Salish at every hearing that I'm at. First of all, I can't do that unless you want to do some counting exercises with me. I'm not going to be testifying in Salish. But also you have to understand just the space we're in, right? Like we're not testifying before our tribal councils, we're testifying before a state body. And so like if we're trying to just make a point, I think it's just English is the most effective way to do that, unless you really can make a point in Kootenai, and then wow, I would love to see that. So kind of my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Jordan. Iku?
I think it depends on what your specific reason for testifying would be. Like if you're testifying specifically to engage and change the mind of an English speaker, then you might have to use English. But if you're interested in, like, for example, if it's a bill on Indigenous languages, I think it would be super cool for someone to do testimony in an Indigenous language. And there's always like language related bills going on. I think that it would be powerful in any setting, and it just depends on what your purpose for testifying would be and who you're trying to influence, whether you're trying to influence anyone or not, or whether you're trying to make a point. And yeah, I think it just depends on what your purpose in doing it is. And I think it's really cool either way if people testified in an Indigenous language in any of the hearings. I think that in general, you would have to have an English translation since most people are English speakers. Yeah, but sweet. I would love to hear that if there's a recording somewhere of that testimony. I'd love to hear it.
Thank you. So the person who asked that question let us know that it was Pat Left Hand when a senator kept saying that all Indigenous people are the same for a second retrocession bill. So just so that you know. So our next question that was submitted to us is what should I do during the interim or when the state isn't in legislative session to continue advocacy work?
Want to go, Iku?
Sure. You can engage on the local level. There's always things happening on the local level, depending on where you're at. That could be with your tribal government. That could be with county or city government. I live in Missoula, so like every single week there's a city council meeting. So if you're interested in any policy related stuff that's on a city or county level, you can always engage in that during the interim. And I think that local level politics is really important, and you can make a lot of impact on the local level, especially in areas that have low populations. We all have more impact in areas that have low populations. And so I would suggest just getting involved on the local level if you're interested in politics or other forms of local level organizing. Right now, there's a lot of like mutual aid organizing that's happening. I know that Flathead has some cool stuff happening in that area. And I know that Browning also has some people who are organizing around social justice issues. So if you're interested in that kind of engaging outside of the political system as well, there's also those kinds of organizing activities happening right now, especially since with coronavirus, there's a lot more economic issues, even though there's always been economic issues, but they're like increased right now because it's hard to get jobs and there's not a lot of assistance. So I think that you can engage locally, politically, or outside of the political system during the interim, or both.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And there's an election coming up, and it's gonna, like, the whole makeup of our state government is gonna look different. We're gonna have a new governor, and regardless, and so whether that's gonna look way different or a little bit different is yet to be seen. A lot of local races are going to have the same impacts. And so it's with coronavirus, and then also the new makeup of our state representatives, senators, and governor, and those political offices. It's like, I would I would urge us all to get involved on those candidates we really believe in right now, because it is so much more helpful to have candidates who just already understand than trying to change minds. And some folks, it's just, Montana Budget and Policy Center is going to figure out how to change minds and put out that report, because I haven't figured out how to do that yet at all levels. I'm trying to crack the code, but I haven't figured it out yet. So elections are really important this year.
Yeah, to add on to that, in addition to elections, because of the census, there's going to be redistricting coming up. So paying attention to, after the elections, what the redistricting commission in Montana is up to is going to be important too.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot of things to keep track of. And speaking of, so our next question is, there are so many bills that impact Indian country, and you both have experience engaging with multiple pieces of legislation during the session. So how do you stay up to date on these issues, and how do you prioritize your efforts? Jordan?
All right. So, yeah, it's a pretty coordinated effort here for the Salish Kootenai tribes. And so I'm sort of the ambassador, or I kind of feel like they put me out in orbit in Helena, and then I'm communicating with folks back here. And so we have like a spreadsheet where I'm writing down all of the bills for different areas, whether it's education, wildlife, economic development, just kind of every single category. And I'm on that Montana leg.gov site. New bills coming out, tapping the ones that they might affect us, and then I'm communicating with tribal council to say, hey, how do we want to come in on this one, and give them some thoughts to think about. And once they give me the green light or red light, and we go from there. I just become real good friends with the website montana.leg.gov. Press into that, and just really the different
Is my internet cutting out? Is other people's internet cutting out? I'm curious what's going on.
Eco, it looks like maybe Jordan and Dahlia froze.
Cool.
I'm assuming we're still on, so maybe I'll just pose that question to you. So there was a lot going on last session. I'm sure you had a lot on your plate. You were tracking a lot of different issues. How did you stay up to date on the issues that you were focused on, and how did you prioritize your efforts?
So one of the things that happened in the last session is a bunch of Indigenous organizers from around the state who were working in the session decided to get together and start tracking those things together because we were very overwhelmed by all the different bills. So one of the places that I personally looked was the State Tribal Relations Committee subcommittee. They always have like a set of policies that they're bringing. So that's one of the places that I always personally looked to see what was happening in terms of bills in Indian country. And then the collective involved people from a bunch of different organizations who also had other priorities. And so we'd just get together on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and talk about what those policies were that we were all prioritizing, when the hearings were, who was going to go to the hearings, whether we needed to organize around them. And that was a super collaborative effort with a bunch of other people. And I think that it was extremely helpful to have a group like that, especially since the vast majority of people who were in the group, that was their first session. And so we were all kind of fish out of water. And yeah, I used MT Ledge, and then there was another bill tracking website, and I can't remember it right now, and I apologize for that fact. That I also was like signed up to get all of the updates on different bills. And I would just go through and like search keywords that I was thinking of, or like native or whatever, and pull up whatever bills there were and click on them and get updates. But you have to do a lot of, I mean, every day people are adding more things to the docket. So you have to do a lot of digging often.
Thanks, Iku. And just to reiterate, so on Tuesday's session, our second session of the symposium, we did go over the laws website. So if any of you have questions about that, we'll be sending out all of these videos at the end of the week, so that you can view it if you haven't seen it yet. Iku, we do have one last question, and that is, what is one of the biggest challenges you've faced in your advocacy or work, and how did you overcome it?
It's like a job interview question. No. I think that there are a bunch of different challenges. One of the major challenges in engaging people in the legislative session specifically is the fact that a lot of it happens when people are at work or when people are unable to engage, and they do that for a reason, and that's because it makes it harder for people to engage. And so I think that's one of the major challenges that we have in any kind of advocacy work, is the fact that it's hard for people to get to Helena. I mean, this session is going to be different. And the hearings happen during the workday, when people are otherwise at work, and not everyone has unlimited funds to just take time off work and go speak on an issue that they care about. And I think that one of the ways you can overcome that, I mean, there aren't a lot of ways to overcome structural issues, but you can have people engage in other ways via sharing their story with journalists, writing in, and also a bunch of advocacy organizations try to make sure that there are gas cards and hotels for people to stay in when they do go to advocate, and are unable to pay their entire way, because yeah, it would otherwise be like hundreds of dollars to go for a day and advocate. And so that's one of the challenges. But I think that there are a lot of structural challenges that are put in place, and especially with engaging Indigenous communities, and they do that specifically, and they have always done that, and they probably always will. So we'll always have to be figuring out innovative ways to get around those issues and those structural challenges that they put in place.
Thank you for bringing that up, Iku. And so, Jordan, it's good to have you back. We have one last question for you. What is one of the biggest challenges you've faced in your advocacy or work, and how did you overcome it?
I get so passionate about issues. I just like the line between my job and my soul is very thin. And so sometimes it just seems like I get so passionate about issues. And um, so I think just like when people disagree with that, it just, I get so disheartened. And so just trying to recognize that all I can do is all I can do, and I can just try my best, and that's it. And then I just have to let it go. And so I guess just finding a way to be at peace when things don't go the way I wish they did, and understanding that it's a long game, understanding that like when you're looking at the tribal history timeline, it goes like our stories go back to at least the last ice age, and some even might go back to the ice age before that, which we're talking 40,000 years ago. And so when we're looking like at this blip in time, it's a blip. And so if we're looking at 10,000 or 40,000 more years, I think we're going in the right direction, and I'm doing my best to make sure we're going in the right direction, and understanding that the world's not going to end probably if this bill doesn't pass, or if it does. And so just coming to peace with that, and just understanding I can just try my best, and that's it. And there's a lot of people trying their best. And so just really leaning on everybody to just keep your spirits high during the session, because it's a roller coaster.
Thank you both. And so we do have one very last question, just very quickly. So how do you view the role of the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs in your lobbying efforts? Iku?
Sorry, repeat that real fast.
So the question is, how do you view the role of the Governor's Office of Indian Affairs in your lobbying efforts?
I think that, how do I view the role? I think personally, my only thing can be from like a personal level, because I didn't professionally interact with them for lobbying very often, because I'm not lobbying the governor or people that work for the governor specifically myself. But I think that, again, the office was a great space to meet people who are Native legislators, and a great way to have a space within the Capitol that feels like it's Native run. Jordan probably has more to answer on that, but.
Yeah, this I don't want to use names, but yeah, what a great office that's been, and resource. They have a lot of information. They're just a great resource, whether it's for the space, whether it's just to like sit on a couch after you're done testifying, whether it's to just talk about different issues that are going on, to hear about it. An earlier question is, how do you know what's going on? Well, that office really is dialed in on to what's going on. And it's just such a hub for, I think, the Indian legislators to meet. And so it's just kind of, when I'm over in Helena, I just figure it's like sort of the clubhouse, and it's a great place to touch base with everybody and really just understand what's going on with Indian bills. And so just really good resource, and really good people tend to be around that place, that office. And Jason Smith, I'm just going to say, I think has done a wonderful job in that role.
Great. Thank you so much for both of your time, Iku and Jordan. Really appreciate you having shared your knowledge and expertise with us in the audience. And we are at time right now, so I want to be respectful of both of your time. And before I let anybody go, I'm going to drop a Google form for evaluation for this session. So please fill it out. It really helps us a lot. But thank you so much again, and hope to see you tomorrow for our last session.